So welcome everybody. This is my finished basement in progress. Thought I'd do a little tutorial on doing a floor for a gym. So just give you an overview. Finished my basement. I've got a little washroom here. Eventually I'll put this engineered hardwood waterproof flooring. I'm not an expert at it, but we'll see how that turns out in a later video. Over here I'll be putting in a sauna. And then the rest will be my gym. And I'm going to continue my hardwood flooring up until that line there. Kind of separates the foyer. And then in the furnace room I'm going to try some of these exercise mats. I just purchased them on Amazon. I'm not sure how well they're going to turn out, but I'm not worried about that right now. So anyway, considered a lot of options for gym flooring. Want to stay away from any hardwood or tile so it wouldn't get damaged. I have some heavy equipment. And I ended up seeing these at Costco. They're called a traction utility mat. And they're 3 foot by 4 foot. They advertise they're good for workshops, barbecues, garages, gyms. And they're very thick. They're about 3/4 of an inch thick. And they're heavy. They're about 46, 47 pounds a piece. And they were kind of awkward getting them down the stairs into the basement, but finally I have enough to do this whole area because I have some pretty heavy gym equipment that'll eventually go here. So I'll be doing this whole floor with these mats. Here's the bottom of the mats here. You can see they got raised circles. And that'll be good for traction. And then the other side, the cat's decided to join me. The other side is a smooth finish. And we've got some flakes or specks in it, so it should give a nice effect for the gym. And then after I put the flooring down, I'll be putting some baseboard all around the edges and just butt it up to the rubber mats. So I started off, I had a concrete floor, and I put down 6mm poly on the bottom. Used Tapcons to attach 1x3s every 16 inch on centers. And then I think it's 3/4 inch tongue and groove plywood over top. So the floor is actually quite stable, quite strong. So I already started off with my first piece. I thought I'd start in the closet, that way if I make any mistakes, it's not going to be too tragic. The mats, by the way, they were $29.99 a piece. So that worked out to about $2.50 a square foot, which I thought was a phenomenal deal. So first mat I got in. I had to cut around all the little corners and that, and I'll show you exactly how that has to be done. So we'll start off with some of the basic tools that you're probably going to need. I have a 4-foot drywall T-square. That's going to come in handy. And then I got some smaller hand squares. You'll definitely need a very sharp utility knife, carpet knife, or drywall knife, which is what I have. And you'll probably be going through a lot of blades. So don't cheap out on that. These are not the easiest to cut. So as far as keeping them in place, there's a lot of suggestions on the internet. Some people use double-sided tape and they put it on the floor first and then drop the mats over top of it. Other people use these metal clips with spikes on one end, so you drop the mats on top and pound them into place. These mats are pretty heavy. I don't anticipate they're going to move around. Worst case scenario, I'm going to experiment with some black inch and 5/8 drywall screws. So they will be not easy. They won't be easily seen in the mat. And if I don't like them, I could just pull them out. So I'm also going to use a 2x4 and a hammer, just kind of hammer things in place. So the first thing I did was I laid out the room. I'm going to run my mats lengthwise from corner to corner. I did all the framing in here, so the walls are very decently straight. And I started off with putting some screws in the floor and then snapping some chalk lines. So it gives me a reference every 3 feet. Can't really see them now, I'll have to re-snap the lines. But every 3 feet I snap lines, and then that way when I'm doing the next row and the row after that, I should be able to keep everything in place and everything straight. You don't want to get into the 4th or 5th row and then having to readjust all the mats. So hopefully I can do this all in the first shot. So let's see how this goes. Just before we get started, I do want to mention that it'll be very easy to scuff your walls. These are a little bit awkward, they're a bit floppy when you're carrying them. And if you do brush up against the wall, which I happen to do, I'm not sure if you can see it here, but this is a freshly painted wall. And I've already scuffed the walls here, so hopefully I'll be able to wipe it off. If not, I'll have to do a little bit of touch-up painting afterwards. It doesn't take much to scuff up the walls. There is no real smell from these mats. I've had them in the basement now for a few weeks. I don't think that's going to be an issue. So I've already got the first mat in place. I'll cut some pieces later on another mat. So the key is to measure twice, cut once, not the other way around. Fortunately, the inside here is 3 feet. It's just over 4 feet to the end, so I will have to put in a little piece. I'm not going to worry about filling in that gap there. I'll remove some of the debris, but it is under a staircase. Nothing much is going to be here, and the mats are really rigid, so I don't think that's going to be too much of an issue. A little bit awkward in here. So there's a bit of gap here. I'm just going to go the other end and hopefully either pull it or tap it in. Nice. So anyway, you can see there's no gap. And I just have that little piece to install over there. So I'll measure it out and I'll show you how I cut these. So let's take our first measurement. Sorry about the shaky hand. So it's about 10 1/8 there. I'm on my elbows and knees here. About 10 1/4. It is 36 inches, actually just over 36 inches wide here, so I won't have to do any cuts on the side. And I don't think it'll expand or contract, but In case it does, it doesn't hurt to leave an 1/8 of an inch or 1/4 inch around the perimeter, around the outside cut. I do want a factory edge against this factory edge. And then that way, once I put up a vinyl baseboard or any type of baseboard that you want, it's going to cover up that joint nicely. So I want to be able to cut the smooth side. So I have to flip this over. Okay, so I'm going to use a black Sharpie. I know it's going to be a little bit difficult to see. I just need it for a reference mark. It's 10 inches. That's all I really need. Measure it again just to make sure. There we go. So if you want, you can do a little line. The key is, when you're cutting, you want to be pushing down on the square so it doesn't move, and you want to make your first score. So. And again, not the easiest to cut. I'll show you a little bit of a trick. After I get about 2 or 3 scores, just make sure I penetrate about 1/8 of an inch. I've got a couple of options available to me. I can drop a couple of 2x4s. And what this is going to do, it's going to, when you push down on it, it starts to open up the gap a bit more, makes it easier for the knife to penetrate further. So now that I've already got a score, I've got a pretty steady hand. So you can just freehand this, just take your time. So it's probably going to take about 7-8 cuts. Another option, once I have even more, put this along the edge. Now you can see how it's really opening up. I can put a little bit of pressure. Key is to cut straight, not on any angles. You want a nice smooth cut. So, nice, decently smooth edge. Now we'll slip this into place. Okay, so I've got my factory edge here. I want it on the factory edge. And let's see how this fits. Without whacking my head too much. So I've got a bit of a wedge on here. Just pull it in. So being a small piece, there is a little bit of movement. So what I'll do is I'll throw a couple of screws in it. both sides. And a couple more over here. So good. So joints are pretty invisible. Can't really see them, and I think worst case scenario, if I do have some joints that I'm not very happy with or they're open, some people have suggested using a black Gorilla Tape. So we'll cross that bridge when we get there. Okay, so now I'm ready to start this room. Some people would suggest that you start in the middle, work your way to the corners. The key is do your measurements very carefully. You don't want to be getting to any major areas where you're going to have to slip in a 1 inch or 3-4 inch piece of mat at the end. That's my preference anyway. I'd like to have at least a half tile as my final cut. Going both ways. So in this case I have 25 feet from this end over to that end. If I were to start with a full mat, it means I'll have a 1 foot piece at the very end, which isn't too tragic, but I've already done my cut. So I've got 10 inches subtracted from that particular mat, so I'm going to start with that one, and then that way I'm going to have an almost 2 foot cut at the end. My personal preference is I'll be staggering my tile, so after my first row's in, I don't want to end or do an exact duplicate layout with the next mat and have all the joints like a cross, so I want to stagger it like you would with a brick. The other issue is that I'm going to start on this end, and when I get up to this little closet there, a mat's going to actually run a little bit before this corner to pass that corner, so I'm actually going to have a nice straight edge. And the final thing is make sure your floor is clean. It looks dusty, but I gave it a really good vacuum. And take note of any areas. The joints are pretty good here, except for this one little area here where can't really see it, but try to lay a square up against it. You can see I got a bit of a gap there. So what I might elect to do is just fill in this area with some kind of a cement or something. Just so I don't have any sudden dips or anything. Not sure how it'll affect the tile if I leave it as is. The tile is pretty thick, but it's not going to take much to patch that up. But all the other joints are really good, and they'll actually be, except for the first one, all the joints are actually going to overlap the joints in the plywood here. So let's get started. Okay, let's start off with the first piece. Again, these are pretty heavy and awkward, but they're kind of manageable. So I've got the cut edge against the edge of the drywall. Just going to slip it in place here. A little bit of tiny gap. Now I'm ready for the next one. So already I can see a little bit of a gap happening. Now, if it's slightly off, I'll go back and I'll straighten it out with a hammer. A piece of plywood. Or 2x4. So now I got my first row in place. Didn't secure it down or anything. I got a little piece at the end here that I'm going to cut. So, what do we got here? Got 20 1/4. And where's the tape here? 20 1/4. So I'm going to cut it at 20 1/8, and that's going to give me a little bit of wiggle room. Now I've got this little closet here. I'm going to wait till I put my second row in case I have to do any adjustments of these mats. Once the second row's in place, everything should line up. I could, wiggle it out from the wall or push any mats a little closer together. And then I'm sure I'm going to have a piece left over for the closet. Okay, time to make the cut. So I don't want to be cutting the rough edge, I want to cut the smooth edge. So, first of all, I'll rough it out. And I want to go factory edge, which is here, the factory edge, which is here. So I'm just going to mark that. Say 20 inches. 28. Just to make sure, measure twice. And once we put some pressure on the T here, just so it doesn't move back and forth, make sure you don't cut yourself. I've only cut a couple pieces already, and I might need a new blade in my knife. Piece of wood, just going to cut it up. Take your time with this. Yeah, take my next piece. I can always use this piece somewhere else. Up a bit more. Once you start cutting it, it starts to give it some gap, which is good. And also putting it on a piece of wood, you're not going to be cutting in anything if you got it on flooring or something. Here I got it on top of the mat, it's not too crucial. There we go. Just like that, ready for my second row. Once the second row goes in, I can reshift the mats any which way I want. So I came up with a plan B. I'm still staggering all my joints. On this one, my next row I started off with a full mat. It's not going to be exactly centered. It'll be a little bit longer at one side. And then I'm going to have a small cut at this end. I'm not overly concerned with it for a couple of reasons. Number one, for me to calculate all the walls, everything to be perfectly centered with all the mats and everything wasn't really worth it. Number two, I'm not sure if you can see it here. Even though these floors are completely, like the subfloor is completely flat, the mats do have a little bit of variance in them. They're a little bit thicker in some areas. Now, it's not enough to really create a tripping hazard, but as you can see, there is a little bit of a raised edge there. And even stepping down on it, it's not really going to do too much. So knowing that, I'm going to go with the advice of a few other people on YouTube, and because it is a gym floor, I'm probably going to use the black Gorilla tape and tape over each joint. You'll be able to see it, but at least there's a couple of reasons. Number one, it's going to seal those joints, so no dirt or anything is really going to get in between the mats. And it's also going to be a little bit smoother. And then over top of this, later, before I put all my equipment in, I'm going to be putting in some 12-foot by 8-foot mats, typically used for garages. They're really thin, but they're very durable. Get them at Costco, and they're about maybe 1/8 of an inch thick, and I'll just center them out in the gym, and it'll go nicely with all my equipment and walls. So again, I think at this point, even though the mats are fairly flat, they're not perfect, and I will be using some Gorilla tape. I know some of you are probably going to go clean your shoes and all that. A little bit of dust on the shoes, but I've already wiped down a couple of these mats. Very easy to do. A little bit of water, you could put a little bit of soap in it, and that's perfect. So a little bit of dust I'm not overly concerned with until I'm at the final stage. So floor is coming along nicely. About 3/4 of the way done. Again, I went with the staggered joints. I think it's going to be stronger. It's going to minimize any movement, having it locked up like you would brick or drywall. I kept about 1/8 of an inch gap around all the corners, and I was careful doing all my cuts. Everything's fitting in really nicely. I know there's a bit of dust on the floor that's difficult to prevent. But all I did was I used a bit of warm water and a cloth, and these mats come up really clean. So at the end of the project, I'll give everything a good wash. And another good tip is, after I do a few rows or a few mats, I always vacuum the next area. Now over here, you can see right there, there was a bit of a jog in the floor, a bit of a difference between the two planks. So I got a little bit lazy. I could have used a concrete or something, but I just used a Durabond 90. And I think once it's under the mats, it's all dry. It is pretty strong. It's just enough so there's no gap or no movement. So I've got a few extra cuts to do. So I got this little bit of floor left to do, and I'll be ending it pretty much where that green tape is. And that's going to present a bit of a dilemma. So on the one side, I'll be using this floating floor, this laminate, and then I'll be butting it up to the rubber. You can see there's quite a difference. The rubber mat's about 3/4 of an inch, and I would assume this is about 1/4 inch, maybe a bit more. So that's going to create a bit of a tripping hazard from when I walk from the hardwood floor over to the rubber mat. So I have to find something that's going to prevent being a tripping hazard. So the store that I purchased the flooring from, they gave me a couple of samples for strips. As you can see, this one normally would sit nicely between two even thicknesses, but this is obviously not going to work. It's just going to create too much of a difference here. So the next piece that they gave me was this one. You can see it's lower on one side and higher on the other. So let me adjust this here. And the key is I don't want to be bolting it to this floor because this is supposed to have room for movement. So that's not too bad, but as you can see, it's not perfectly even here. I want it to be a little bit less of a dramatic step here. Otherwise, it's going to create too much of a ridge here and too much of an angle here. So I'm either going to have to find another type of reducer, which I'm sure there's different ones out there. I haven't quite explored it. Or I came up with a slightly different idea. So I used a piece of scrap, piece of mat, and what I did was I created my own groove right here just to see how it would look. So it would kind of butt up like this. And then using this reducer where it's lower on one end than the other, you can see that's more of a flat finish. The groove here is probably a little too deep, so if I can minimize it and bring it something like that, I think that might work. But it's going to be a little bit tricky to try and get there. So you can see the gap right along here is the width of the groove, and then I'm going to have to calculate the distance from here to here, which will be probably about 1/4 inch, maybe 3/16. So I'll show you how I did that. Okay, so I'm going to use this as a bit of a template. You can see this is the higher edge, which will be on the mat. And I want to be able to calculate the distance from this groove here to the edge, and then come back probably about 1/8 of an inch. So that should be good there. I want a little bit of play. I don't want to have the gap over here, and then I'm going to have to fill this in. So I come back about here, which is about 1/2 inch. Let's put a little mark there. And then the key is to have a really sharp blade, and I'll find a long piece of, once the floor is down, I use a nice straight edge, then I'm going to score this several times. I want to be able to go down probably more than 1/4 inch, not too much more. Oops. Now this will be the tricky part, because I don't want to, I'm going to have to do this by hand. And again, I don't want to go down too far, and stay probably about this distance here, so you can see that I'll be cutting probably about here. So it'll be probably about a bit of 1/4 inch. And this is where you're going to have to do it by eye. So that's roughly a 1/4 inch there. And I'm just going to use my thumb as a guide, try and keep my blade as still as possible. score the edge there. I'm going to have to do it several times. And again, you're just doing this by hand. You can always take off a little bit more if you need to. So we can open this up. I'm going to take a bit of patience and steadiness. So, you can see that's pretty good. That's a really good fit right there. So I can clean the edges a little bit. And I got a bit of play, so if I gotta move it around a bit. You can see this is almost flat. And then what I'll do is I'll have the hardwood floor here, which will be floating. And then I can really, if I wanted this solid, I can put a couple of screws in there, run a bead of caulking here, and then put like a gripping type caulking or PL200, put a nice bead right along here, keeping it away from the floating floor. You don't want to be getting any of the caulking on the floor because it needs a bit of space to move. But once that's all caulked in and everything, that's going to look nice. It's going to be a nice transition strip right there. So if you have any other ideas, leave a comment below and let me know what you think of this idea. So here's an example of what I'm hoping to accomplish eventually. I'm just using a piece of scrap baseboard. And you can see that once it's over top of the mat, it's going to be a nice finish. If there's a gap or anything, I can always use this type of molding afterwards, bring it down a little bit tighter. Or I can use a piece of glue down, whatever works. I'll probably end up going with some type of a molding like this. But this little gap here is not an issue for me. And that'll be right at the very end stages after all the flooring is in and taped down. So now I'm going to work on this end piece. See, I got a bit of a difference in the wall here. So I'm going to measure, I want to have factory edge to factory edge when I do my cutting. So I'll measure from the wall. I got just over 30 inches, so I'll go 30 inches here. And 30 inches here. Just write this down. And this nib be 34 1/4. And this will be 24.5. So I got about a 1/4 inch gap that's going to go, make sure I got that right, 1/4 inch gap that's going to go around the wall. Again, the baseboard is going to fill it in, and I don't think there'll be any shrinking or expanding, but in case there is, there's going to be enough tolerance for it. So get ready for the overall cut. I'll do the big cut first. And I want 34 up here. this so it doesn't move. And then I don't want to cut on an angle like this. I want to keep it as straight as possible. Just take your time. Once you score it a few times, it should be deep enough where you can finish it off by hand. So right now it's probably about 3/8 of an inch, 1/4 inch. And what this does is each time you cut and you put more pressure here, it's going to open up this joint more and make it a lot easier to cut. You can see that with each cut, it actually opens up on its own. Makes it easier. Makes it easier to cut all the way through. And that's it. So I'm going to turn this around so I can see the floor over there. This is the factory edge going up against lengthwise. This will be the butt joint here. So it's easy for me to see what the mark is. Make sure. 24.5. 34.25. So I have a leftover piece that's a little bit bigger than what I need. So again, I'm just going to go 30. Black Sharpie isn't the best, but I can see it just enough. And I'll just double check. 30. And I want to keep the pressure on the T or whatever straight edge you're using. That way it's not going to wiggle around. So I just lightly scoring it. Each time I score it, I get a little bit deeper. Probably about 4 times on good enough where I can do it by hand. The best tip is to put a bit of pressure on this while you're cutting. What that's going to do is going to open it up, make it easier. Sharper the blade, the better. Again, you want to cut perpendicular. You don't want to be on any angles here. You want it as nice, clean cut as possible. So this is the back end to the wall. So I'm actually going to move it like this. So I'll have the factory edge against the existing and the butt edge. So it's going to be nice and square throughout. And I've got my other measurements, which is 34.25 and 24.5. Marker. So 24.5 and 34. the same way as you would put it on the floor. It keeps it easier to guess or to make your marks and be accurate. That's like these, I can just use my tape as a guide. I could probably freehand this. So I'm going to put a bit of pressure. They'll put my fingers too far over, I don't want to slice them up. So I'm just gripping this here. And slice myself open, yeah. There we go. These should fit. So let's give this a shot. See, I stuffed the wall doing that. Give it a little tap. And I got a nice clean joint all the way around. And it's a little bit tight to the wall, but that's okay. So as luck would have it, this final piece here, the opening or the space is just around 48.5 inches. And that is a full piece there. So what I'll do is I'll drop in this piece of mat here. And then I'll make sure that I just kind of adjust this mat. So there'll be about a 1/4 inch gap between that pillar and a 1/4 inch gap against the wall, and then the baseboard's going to hide it nicely. So let's try this. And I don't want to scuff the wall here, so I'll just push it into place after it's down. Nice. So again, I got a little bit of a gap just over here. I'll put in that filler piece later. And then against the wall here, there's about a 1/4 inch gap, so that's going to be perfect. And then again, after the floor is completely done, I'll show you how I'm going to use that Gorilla Tape. So finally get near the completion part. Only got a few more rows left. I'm going to be going again up to that green line, and then it'll be hardwood flooring on the other side. So just to keep things consistent, I have this post in the middle, and there's just enough of a gap that I don't want to be ending my tile here. I just want to give maximum strength. So again, I have 2 full tiles here, so I don't want to end it there. And then 4 feet comes to about here. So probably what I'll do is I'll start off with like a 30-inch or 36-inch piece, and that'll overlap to here, and then here, and I still have a half decent sized tile here. Keeps everything nice and straight and solid, and I didn't want to really end a joint right there. Not that it really matters much, but I might as well be consistent. So here's a little tip. You can see the joint on my last row is here. So technically I could probably start off with a full piece here, but when I measure it out, 8 feet comes really close to this joint in the plywood. And I'm not sure you can see it or not, but there's a little tiny gap underneath. And so if I were to end it here, this mat will be sitting a little bit higher, this will be a little bit lower. So I'm going to calculate so a mat goes pretty much half over, half over. So if a full mat here, I'm not going to notice this. This is just naturally going to be in the floor. I'm not going to notice a hump. Again, it's a gym floor. It's not worth trying to level everything out 100%. It's not really worth it. It's decently level. A couple of areas I did fix up. So instead of starting with a full tile and ending it right on that plywood joint, I'm going to stagger it. So I'll start off with a piece maybe over here, and then it'll end over there somewhere. So just to get really picky here, just give you an example of why one side might have a little more play. You can see that this is the factory edge, and you have these raised parts that are full. So it's really going to sit tight on the floor. When you look at the other side, you can see how it catches over here a little bit, but when you get over here, it's slightly crooked. So you can see there'll be a little bit of give, not much, but it's enough that still justifies me putting the Gorilla Tape on the top side, and then that way it'll seal everything nicely and there'll be no movement whatsoever. So officially on my last row in this room, and again, where the green tape is, that's approximately where my hardwood floor is going to end from this side. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to leave out these 2 pieces. It's about 16 inches across, so one mat should be able to do these 2 pieces. I didn't want any extra joints in here, so what I did was I measured from that wall to 96 1/4 right there. And then that way one mat, I won't have to do any end cuts, and I'll have one joint somewhere in the middle. So we'll also look at this mat. Remember before I had that one joint that was kind of raised, and as you can see now that I put the mat fully over it, you're not really going to notice any humps or bumps or anything like that. So I think it'll be easier to wait until the hardwood floor is done. That way I'm going to have a more precise finish point, and it'll be easier to cut the rubber mats to fit and give that little gap, and then I'll have to put in that whatever you call it, that spacer bar in between, and we'll do that at the end. So last thing I'm going to do before I leave this floor, I'm just going to throw in a couple of screws because it is the end piece. I don't want it shifting at all. You see the screws aren't going to damage the mat when I pull them out. And see, they're pretty much invisible, that little tiny hole. So I already popped in a few screws along the edges here. So this way the whole floor is secured. It's not going to go anywhere. And then I'll eventually be, once everything's done with the hardwood and all that, and I put in my final strip, I'm going to sweep the floor, vacuum it, and then give it a mop, nice and clean. Then I'm going to start using that black Gorilla tape, which I see a lot of people recommend on YouTube. So, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to do the butt joints first. So all the 3-foot joints everywhere, I'll do all those first, and then when I do my long seams, it'll go from end to end, right over the edges of the tape from the butt joints. And then that way there's going to be no breaks in tape. There's going to be no edges lifting up or anything. So we'll take some video of that when we get to that stage. So just a quick look. It's about 400, just over 400 square feet, between 400 and 450. All the flooring is pretty done, with the exception of the little strip and a couple of little pieces here and there, which I'll do right now. And everything's all tied in nicely. There's really no gaps, no seams. The floors turned out really well. And eventually I'm going to put a piece of trim around the bottom. That's my dumbbell rack, homemade. Now I'll put in some J-clamps or J-hooks on both sides, and then that way my bars can sit all up on nicely stacked, and then any accessories up there. But again, back to the flooring. We got a few mats left over, and you see there's not a whole lot of waste that I really did in this whole room. So it was planned out pretty well. And even in here is all done. Okay, so now that the majority of the flooring is done, except for this little strip, I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to put some of the Gorilla tape on all the seams. I want to keep it clean. I don't want too much dust or dirt falling into the cracks. So after giving it a good vacuum, I'm just going to mop the floors, let it dry, put on my good shoes, and then start doing the taping. So while the floor is drying, make sure all your joints are nice and tight. If you have to, go around the edges, maybe give it a bit of a pry bar. Just don't damage the drywall above where the baseboard's going. Sometimes all you need to do is just give it a little tap here and there. Everything's pretty good. So obviously I'm going to have to move some equipment before I do the whole floor. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to do all the butt joints, all the small joints first. And then I'm going to run, I'll go over here, this might be better. So all these little butt joints will get done first. Then I can do a complete piece of tape from wall to wall. And then that way there's not going to be any loose edges, anything sticking up. The long piece of tape is going to cover where the butt joints end. And it'll be just one smooth piece of tape all the way through. Not that I'm worried about any lifting or anything, but I might as well maximize any potential of movement, lifting, peeling, whatever. So let's get started. So the floor seems dry enough. I'm going to start. So this is the tape I'm using. It's Gorilla. It's almost 3 inches wide. Each roll is 25 yards, so 75 feet. And this is what it's like out of the packaging. Bit of shine to it, but it looks really tough, really durable. So to get started, it says you can rip it by hand. I'm just going to use a pair of scissors. The roller, I'm just going to experiment. Maybe I'll roll it over the joints afterwards, get any air bubbles out. We'll see how that experiment goes. So let's get started. So I'm going to do my butt joints first, and then I'm going to run a lengthwise right across. So I'm just going to overlap this longer joint by about an inch, so it should be covered. Be as accurate as I can be. Don't want to minimize any wrinkles. Just push it in later with your hands. So this one over here. So I'm going to overlap about ½ inch to an inch. Try and keep it centered. And then push outwards. Not sure how effective the roller is, but can't hurt. So over here, I've got a seam. That is, there's no joints over here, so I can go right across, and that's going to cover this up. Nice and tight. There we go. Make sure the edges are down nice. Try and push out any little air bubbles that are in there. And there we go. Alright, so now I'm going to do this long joint. See how my little butt joints are in place, and that way my tape's going to go right over the edges here, so there'll be no lifting. Verdict on the roller, not overly effective, can't hurt, but I find that just taking your time, this is really strong tape, taking your time and just kind of massaging the tape with your hand, get rid of all the little air bubbles. Do a few feet at a time and give it a pull, give it a stretch, just so you're not going to get any creasing. that. I think you can afford to lift up the tape once or twice. After that, you're going to start losing the glue. And so now I'm just going to keep going this way. Instead of pushing back, at my lesson, I'm going to push this way. Just really push it in with my fingers. That way I'm not getting any creasing. You can see how these little butt joints here, you're completely overlapped. So now I have one big piece of tape going right across. Knee pads would be a good idea too. And then, so I'm not pushing it this way, I'm putting a bit of tension on this, keeping it low, and then just pushing it in. Any little air bubbles can be pushed down. And tight to the corner. A little piece of dirt under here. Other than that, looks pretty good. So I'm on my last strip, and a couple of things I'm learning along the way is that when I'm doing long pieces, instead of pushing out this way, I always push towards where the tape is, seal it right down, try and keep it centered. This way you're not going to have any creases or bubbles. Try and keep it as centered as possible. And then when you're done, go back and just make sure everything is pressed down nicely. Go over it a couple of times. And that should be the final strip. Came up a bit short on this corner. So I'm just going to overlap that little piece. And voila. Over it with your foot or your hand. That's what the floor looks like when it's done. I had to move over some equipment halfway through. So as you notice, it's not completely making all your seams invisible, but it's not meant to be. It's a gym. It's meant more for function than for beauty, even though it looks okay. So a couple of things, a couple of tips that I've learned. Even though I vacuumed the floor and mopped them, the floor appeared to be dry on the surface, and when I started taping over the seams, there was a little bit of moisture that was caught in the seams, and it didn't make the tape stick so well, so I had to wait until the floor was completely dry. Another thing is, when you're handling the tape, try not to be touching the sticky part too much or lifting it up anything, because every time you do that, little bit of glue gets lost and it's not going to stick as well. So I've got about 400 square feet of floor, maybe a bit over, and I've used about two and a half rolls of the tape, and so that's 75, so maybe about 200 feet. So 3 rolls should do you about 400 feet. Now these are 3 foot by 4 foot mats, Again, if you're using long rolls or 4-foot by 6-foot mats, obviously you're going to be using a little bit of tape. Already I can see a couple of corners here. Their edge is not quite stuck down, so I'll be going over all this. So that's what the floor looks like thus far. Alright, so finally at the end of the project for the flooring. So as you can see, I've got the wood floor here, and I left a 1/2-inch gap in between this and the rubber mat. And then what I did was I'm going to use a reducer. So I wanted to groove the rubber so it'll be kind of flat. So essentially it's going to look like this. So what I did was I set this up on top of the mat and then cut along here, and I made my own groove, so I had to slip a knife in under here. And as long as this edge here is pretty straight, and I tried to go down about a 1/4 inch. So as you can see, it's reasonably flat. So this piece of track that's supposed to clip into here, that's kind of useless sitting in there. It's not gonna push down. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to use flexible caulking. I'm going to fill up this gap here. I'm going to put just a dap here, and then I'm going to fill this up with caulking the groove. And as you can see, I put some screws in the mat, so there's going to be no movement here. And then the caulking is flexible enough, so this being a floating floor, I shouldn't have any issues with any contraction or expansion. So let's see how it turns out. Okay, so I've got my strip already pre-cut, and hopefully I didn't put too much caulking in. Push. And so far it's pretty good by itself, but I'm just going to put some weights on this, and I'll do that all the way down. And so right there is a nice transition. You can see I'm going to have to push it in a few areas. And we'll take a look at it in a minute. So I think this technique worked. The weight should keep it in place. Again, I used a real flexible caulking silicone, and you can see it's nice and tight here, but it has enough flexibility to move. And then here, as you can see, is pretty flat. If we really, really want to split hairs, I could fill this tiny little gap in here with caulking. But overall, I'm pretty happy with the job. And I'll give it a day and take the weights off, and we'll see. We'll see if everything held down nicely. So already, I'm all done with the flooring. So everything's complete. The little transition piece here, and that's in nicely. And what I ended up doing was filling the little gap in between the rubber floor and the transition strip with a bead of silicone. not the latex caulking, but silicone. And then as you can see, once I install the trim and everything's nice and tight. I had about 1/8 of an inch gap between the drywall and the rubber. And in cases where you're not putting any trim or anything, what I did was, just because this is just a storage area, I just used some of the leftover silicone and filled in the gaps. That's going to stop any dirt and dust, everything falling in, and it's now really easy to clean. So you can see flooring looks pretty good. It's all the way around. Oddly enough, I had that gray mat I purchased about 20 years ago from Costco. It's really for garage floors, but it held up really well. And I thought, okay, I'll just throw that on top, no harm done. I don't really need it. The beauty of this type flooring is if you ever want to convert, the room to a activity room, rec room, whatever, you can always put carpet over it, hardwood flooring, anything like that. So I'll just give you an example of the flooring I was originally considering doing. A lot of you will recognize this 2 foot by 2 foot foam matting that interlocks. I think it's called Puzzle Mat. You get it at Amazon. And you can see it's about 1/2 inch thick. It's foam, it's really comfortable. And what I ended up doing was I did purchase it beforehand, and I just put it in my furnace room storage room. It held up really well. It's supremely easy to work with, easy to cut, interlock, but I don't think it's going to hold up well if you put it in a gym and you're using heavy equipment. So this is basically going to be a really light traffic area. It doesn't move, it's easy to clean, and again, really easy to work with, very light. And see, I had a couple of the rubber mats left over, so I just butted it up, sealed it up with some clear silicone. And just give you an example, this being about 1/2 inch thick, and the rubber mat I used, obviously a lot more durable, it's about 3/4 inch thick. The price difference, so the mat, or the puzzle mat that I got from Amazon, worked out roughly to about $1.50 a square foot. And then the 3 foot by 4 foot rubber mats from Costco, it was, I thought it was a really good price. It was about $2.50 a square foot. So you can really see the difference. And of course, this type flooring is going to last, well, it's going to outlast me anyway. So we're all done. All right, so final recap. When you purchase your flooring, the rubber mats, if you're getting the same ones I got from Costco, do a little bit of math while you're laying it out. You want to have fairly full pieces along all the edges. You don't want to end up at the very end with like a 1 inch or a 2 inch piece. It's going to be a little bit more difficult to work with. And what I did was I started with my longest wall. I just basically laid out one whole row. And then when I came back, and I'll show it over here, I chose to stagger the butt joints. Number one, I think it looks a little bit better. And number two, it's going to be a lot stronger. It's the same principle as you would do when you're doing brickwork or flooring or drywall. You always stagger your joints. So once I laid down the first couple of rows, the mats weren't moving, everything was nice, solid, straight. I just continued, finished everything off. And as you can see, all the butt joints are staggered. And then before I put on the Gorilla Tape, Gorilla Tape I used for a couple of reasons. Number one, I didn't want any dust or dirt falling into the cracks, so it seals it up really nicely, and also it makes it easier to clean. So after I mopped and vacuumed the floor, that's when I put the Gorilla Tape. And I think the best thing to do is lay down your Gorilla Tape all along your butt joints first. And the reason for that is once you lay down a full strip, which basically goes the length of the room all the way to the back, it's going to cover up any edges. There's no edges that, like, you can see the edges through the tape, but there's no exposed edges. So when you're walking over it, it's not going to peel up. So in this whole gym flooring, there's really no exposed edges because I ran full pieces along the length, and prior to that, I just sealed up all the butt joints. The other key is, the next step is to leave about 1/8 of an inch around the sides, because once you put up baseboard, here I put up wood baseboard, but you can use the vinyl baseboard, which I actually used in here. Not overly happy with the vinyl, but it covers everything up nicely. And if you have any exposed ends, just use a silicone, not a latex caulking. A silicone is going to add a little bit of flexibility. If you're really worried about, like, let's put it this way, once this floor is all weighed down, it's not moving anywhere. But as a precaution, like what I did here, where I butted it up to my floor, my wood floor, I threw in a couple of drywall screws because I have a wood subfloor underneath. This floor is not going to move. If you have concrete, I'm sure you could throw down some adhesive on the floor. I don't really think it's going to be needed unless you think you're going to have a small piece, because once it's Gorilla Taped, this whole floor is not going to move. And it's going to last, and I actually think it looks like a proper gym floor. So anyway, that's it. Hopefully this video will help a few of you people out, and please leave me a comment if you think I did a good job or if I could have done something differently. And if you have your own advice, I would really love to hear from you. So till next time, happy flooring.